I did start a security champion cross-functional team, and I invited key people from across the company, design, sort of infrastructure, and pretty much every organization I could think of. I invited someone from that org to be part of this. It's a fairly small group. It was maybe a dozen of us.
Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Metters and Ramin Lamay.
Hey, welcome back, everyone, to Securing the Future podcast. It's good to be back with everybody. As usual, my trusty co-host, Ramin Lamay, is here.
What's up, guys?
And he will continue to have the same emotional reaction every time we start our podcast. Today, we're going to kind of focus in a lot more around product security. And who better to have on our show than James Zollinger? James, we are really stoked to be able to have you on the show. And yes, I did say the word stoked. It's great to have you. How are you?
I'm great, Jesse. Thank you to you and Ramin for having me on. I hope that your stoked state is justified today.
So yeah, our focus and the topic today really is around product-led security and how to build a world-class product security program. James has a really interesting background, which I'm excited for you to share some of your story and also the story that you have working at Netflix for 11 plus years, being really one of the first security hires there. And, I think many people who have followed Netflix's history knew that was one of the top, if not the top product security program ever built, probably, in my opinion. Again, that's an opinion, it's not fact, but there's a lot that we can all learn. I think about all the clients that I service when it comes to recruiting that are all heavily focused around a product, right? And so being able to understand the nuances of how that all came together for you guys, the team dynamic, the culture, the technical, real excited to kind of dig into that kind of stuff. So James, maybe a little just intro of kind of your background and kind of, walk through a little of the story. I think it's a combination of the things you did at Netflix and even maybe some of the work at Humane, if we get time to get into that as well.
Sure. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. I did start out at Netflix as basically the first product security engineer hire. I joined when that part of the organization, the streaming part of the organization, was maybe 20 people, including the device folks that were later spun out to work on Roku. And so it was really, I think, an incredibly unique opportunity for me to go from engineering and into leadership. I think very hesitantly, frankly, to go into leadership and build from the ground up an organization that I think effectively we were pushed into an arena where we had to care very deeply about security because we were trying to convince Hollywood to sell us their content, and they were looking for reasons not to do that. And so I think that security within Netflix initially was very much geared towards convincing some very, very, frankly, paranoid players that we had what it took to keep things in line for them. And so, I became an engineer. We worked and we got streaming going back in 2007, and we ramped up from there. And as we saw success with people really wanting to stream content instead of just get those shiny discs by mail, which is where we all started, it took off faster, I think, than anybody could have predicted. I think everybody at Netflix was surprised at how fast streaming really took off. And so, we were very successful in changing user habits, and as we did that, we ramped from hundreds of people up to many millions of people. Clearly, the organization needed to grow, and I think one of the unique things that we were able to do at Netflix was to start out from a place where we cared. In other words, it wasn't an organization where we built a product, later on got harmed by poor security choices or poor product security choices, and had to respond to those. We were from the very outset. We cared about the product security because we had to. And so it was a unique opportunity because many people who have worked in product security will relate to this. We weren't retrofitting something with security. We were starting from scratch and doing the right things. And that's like a breath of fresh air for anyone who's had to do the retrofit. So from there, we ramped the organization up. I built an organization from that background, people who really care deeply, not just about the security, but about the user experience associated with that security. I left Netflix after about 11 years. And then for the past couple of years, I was working at a startup as head of product security. Frankly, I was doing everything, including learning how to to be a cybersecurity guy. I sort of trial by fire in that role. So I have a little bit of understanding of the cybersecurity space as well. But my passion still is with product security. I enjoy thinking through user experience implications and working directly with designers, UI designers, and so forth to make the absolute best product that our users will enjoy.
James, you said a lot and definitely appreciate your experience, your knowledge, your background. But I do want to put you on the spot with kind of like a question around product security. Give me kind of like your elevator pitch on how you can set up a successful program. Just to share your message to others, right? Because I think product security is one of those areas where I typically see it separate than the enterprise or infrastructure security, and it's not easy to get it right? So I'd love to kind of just pull out of from your brain, what are some of in your elevator pitch, or however you want to phrase it, like what are some of the reasons why you were successful at product security, or what have you seen work?
Great question. Appreciate the putting me on this aspect of that, Ramin. Hopefully I'll get a chance to return the favor at some point, but it's a great question. I think it's relevant, this discussion. Okay, so I'll sort of, I've got a lot of ideas here, so please cut me short if I'm going long. I think that product security is the ultimate sort of shift left approach, right? We talk about shift left, and if you look at the exponential graphs of what it costs to find a bug, you find it in the design phase, it's cheap. You find it out in the field, it's incredibly expensive. And I think security, that's compounded because when you find a security flaw in the field, it isn't just, some kind of functionality of the product that suffers. It may be the entire reputation of the company. I think, my canonical example is when Sony did their random number generator implementation, when they returned the number 4, they effectively lost, $2 billion in market cap overnight. And so, that can be, the exponential sort of cost of doing security wrong is a very real thing. So I think that the first one is like what I was alluding to earlier, which is start from scratch. Humane security was involved in the design of the hardware. It wasn't enough involved, but it was involved enough to make what was a really great, from a security standpoint, maybe the best security of any device I've ever seen, including, this would be a contentious thing to say, but I would challenge, engineers at Apple to debate me on some of the things that we did at Humane. And so, I think that having an upfront investment in security, not the retrofit like I was alluding to earlier, is probably the most important thing. And then I think there are if I'd say the two most common mistakes I see in product security and how you set up the organization is, number one, the user experience is often one of the missing components. And what I mean by that is, if I take an example from Netflix, the absolute best product security engineers that company had, when I was leading the organization, were maybe like half-time security engineers. Like they were half-time full into the product and the user experience and thinking through flows of how the user used it. I'll give you an example. If you have Netflix, hopefully you've used the download feature. Are you familiar with the? Okay. Yeah. You're right. So you can download content now on your iPhone or your Android device, take it on the airplane with you. Well, when the organization was looking around for saying, like, who's going to build that, they saw what a massively cross-functional project that was. And an engineer in my organization became the lead on that feature, not because it was a security feature, it was because security was part and parcel to that feature working well. And because of the complexity of that feature, the cross-functional nature of it, they needed someone who understood everything, had a holistic view of the product and infrastructure. And those are your good product security people, are the ones that have an complete soup to nuts view of not just the security, but of how the user interacts with that product. And so, that the engineer was sort of immensely suitable for that role. And I would say, arguably, hopefully you've used it and like it, it made a very, very robust implementation for that. So user experience is, I think, often missing this, and getting my engineers to rethink that they're not just looking at security, they're looking soup to nuts at the user experience and getting them to acknowledge they're not building Fort Knox. There is an idea in product security of good enough security, right? And getting engineers who are probably used to thinking in terms of secure enclave or PKI or these really hardcore cryptographic or security related technologies to take a step back and think, what is going to allow the user to have the best experience was a retraining that I had to do with a lot of my engineers. And frankly, this is probably the other side of that coin that people aren't usually aware of. Whenever somebody would come in from a large company, especially leaders in other organizations that would come in from a large company, they were so used to product security being the barrier that they had to get over that I would always spend time with them to inform them that, hey, we're not here to be that barrier. We're here to make the product successful. And we're not here to be any kind of security barrier for you. We're not here to sign a paper that says you went through a security review. We're not here to be an impediment to progress. In fact, if you want to ignore us, you can. I've got a lot of stories about people ignoring us, by the way. We can get to that at some point. But I'm going along here. So the first one is the user UX component and the implications to the org. And then I would say that, the second one, and I think this gets more to the heart of what you're asking, Ramin, is the organizational structure. Yeah. And at Netflix, we had a really special opportunity to build an organizational structure where when I hired, I was hiring for security understanding and an engineering mindset, a holistic engineering mindset. But even more importantly, I would argue, was that the engineers had to have soft skills to the point where their collaborative and their ability to work cross-functionally was a better indicator of success than whether they had a PhD in cryptography or cryptanalysis. And so hiring for engineers both at Netflix and Humane that were just incredibly good at working with others was a recipe for success. And to extend that one step further, at Netflix, what we kind of, I'd say, almost pioneered from what I've seen in at least other organizations is that we would have almost like a dotted line type of integration model where these engineers that were assigned, let's take this download feature as an example. The engineers working on the download feature from the security team, the product security team, would work effectively and show up at the weekly meetings of the teams they were working with, at the cross-functional meeting. They were in some ways almost dotted line. In a few instances, were dotted line reporting, not to me or to managers in my org, but to other managers. And we did that very intentionally to embed them, get them working shoulder to shoulder with those engineers. And so I think the organizational structure of having that kind of model of dotted line reporting and project-based collaboration was key to our success. And I'll pause there. Hopefully I've answered your question.
No, I think you did a great job. And I think, you brought out 2 points that I think are really key, right? So one, you call it your organizational chart, but I would call it leadership, right? It's that same leadership that had you guys investing in, shifting left, right? And that leadership is what helps remove some of those barriers when your company gets bigger and you create these silos, and then, you're trying to set up these cross-functional teams to work, successfully together. I've seen that fail time and time again, right? And it's that leadership where it's that accountability, right? That person, understands the product, they understand their customers, they understand security, they understand the application, and they're really bringing things together, right? I think that's, a huge part of some of the success that I've seen around product security. And it starts with leadership, right? How do you, incentivize people? If you incentivize behavior like just go, remediate vulnerabilities, well, that's going to create one outcome. Go incentivize and say, create the best product we can and secure it at the same time. It's going to incentivize another outcome, right? And I actually have read both the Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph leadership books around Netflix as well. And you can hear that in both their tones, right? They were very much about empowering people and making them accountable and giving them the room to solve for these complex problems. So I think, your example really reiterates that as well. And, to truly shift left, you have to do more than just, point resources and dollars at a problem. You have to really move the problem up the stack and make people more accountable, and then give them the resources to solve it successfully. The other part of how, you talked about the cross-functional teams, I think, that's another challenge that I see anytime a company gets bigger than a startup, right? You've been in the startup world recently, so I'm sure, you have a different comparison there. The second you create a department, you create a silo, right? And it creates barriers in these cross-functional groups where people are like, well, that's not my problem, that's someone else's. I'm just here to reduce vulnerabilities or to tell the developers what to do, right? So, I feel like those are some of the other challenges that I see for especially larger enterprise companies that try to tackle product security. And I've always been a big component of security champions type of program where, you're not adding a security person, you're, creating a security person, right? Take, a really good developer and, add them to your team on the security team and say, hey, we need your help. Here's what we're trying to achieve. Help us bake this, into your application or to your product, right? I've seen a lot of success where, security is a second functionality versus the primary for a developer or product person. And, you can learn security, right? Security isn't rocket science at the end of the day, right? There's certain, requirements, there's certain controls that you want to bake into your products, but, you can't teach UX the same way, right? The example you brought up, that's, a mindset. That's a way of how someone thinks and feels when they're going through things.
Yeah,
I'll pause
100%.
there myself.
No, absolutely. In fact, the point you made about the security champion, I actually started a cross-functional organization. Even though Humane was only about 200 or so people, I did start a security champion cross-functional team, and I invited key people from across the company, design, sort of infrastructure, and pretty much every organization I could think of. I invited someone from that org to be part of this. It's a fairly small group. It was maybe a dozen of us. And I wanted, of course I asked for them to volunteer. I didn't, there was no arm twisting here. And so I found the people that were interested enough in security to come in, and it was a two-way street. So for example, I didn't know that much about AI at the time. And so we brought someone in from the AI group that was really integrating the AI components into our product and said, hey, can you present this month, right? And then when they would present, we would bring out, okay, well, we've been hearing about this prompt injection thing, like how are we going to get ahead of that? But having this two-way sharing in that cross-functional organization of security champions was one of the things I really looked forward to. We were so busy at Humane, we didn't always, do the biweekly or monthly meeting. We skipped a couple, I'll admit. But when we did have them, they were really incredible.
Yeah, I felt like there was two things that I also picked out. And I feel like this is so key, especially the more we're seeing the building of AI tools. It kind of comes in play here too, but it's context. Think about everything that we do. Context is so important. And how do you drive an organization where context across an organization is better communicated, right? Because like, as an example, if you're having a discussion and you're married, which I am, and Ramin, and I think James, you might be too. So, what happens when you misunderstand someone? You didn't have enough context to understand how they were processing that, how they were thinking. It's the same in an organization, right? Like if you don't have enough context of what you're trying to secure in product, or what's the user experience like you said, then you're not going to be able to think through how to solve the problems the proper way. And so how do you foster an organization culture that drives more collaboration to provide the right context? And it sounds like that was a big thing that you guys did. It was like the intentional ways of cross collaboration and intentionality as a leader to, at the beginning of a company's growth, build that into the culture. So that way, this is who we are. And like you said, it is hard, probably almost impossible sometimes, to go and change that in an organization that's already built something. And now you're trying to come in and change everything. That's a lot harder to do. Not impossible, but very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with the context comment. And there are a number of ways to do that. At least, I should probably draw a distinction here, though. Actually, Ramin, you alluded to this earlier. When you go from like a medium-sized business to a large business, which, I lived at Netflix through that transition, things actually necessarily work differently, right? And I've got a good friend who's a GM over in Europe, and he always told me the number was 1,500. In fact, he's got an organization that he tries to cap at 1,500 employees because of this sort of model moving from kind of a trust first. There's a few enough people I can kind of know everybody to hey, I can't keep up with the hiring rate here. I clearly don't know everybody, right? It's like, there's also a high school thing. My daughter's in high school, so we kind of looked at that when she was deciding where to go. But there's a trust first mentality that you can foster in a healthy organization that gets a lot harder around 1,500 employees. A lot of what I'm saying, you said, Ramin, that you've read the No Rules book by Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer, which is a fantastic book I would recommend to anyone. That culture, isn't dead now, but I think it's pared back tremendously from what it was. And that book was written about the Netflix pre-1500 employee culture, frankly, that was prior to 2016, I'd say. So, but coming back to your context point, yes, absolutely. And I will say that prior to that 2016 transition from a trust first, it was so organic and easy, Jesse. I would have a feature, and because myself and my engineering were so embedded already in the product, that when something was coming, it wasn't going to blindside us. We were already in the conversations where the product decisions were being made. And it was just this organic process of saying, hey, well, let me help you do some security integration there where we have a concern. And then once we kind of hit the 1,500 employee mark, we had to move to a different model. And that different model was one where I had a lot of really very hard discussions with my organization of, hey guys, we're now consultants, right? We're no longer effectively hitting the sort of like organic, we know everybody and can integrate with everyone. We now have to start advertising. I remember going in front of a large crowd of engineers, describe to them the new interaction model that I'd vetted with my team, because we could no longer do that organic thing. The organic thing is the most comfortable and the easiest to do because there's not really any policy or any rules that you have to set in that world. But when you move beyond a certain number of employees, that breaks down very quickly.
When you try to make things repeatable, right? Scalable.
Yeah.
Your number was 1,500. Mine was 5,000. So once my company that I was at for a while hit 5,000, and I left when they were 30,000, and I didn't really see a change from 5,000 to 30,000. They could have gone and become 100,000, and it would still been the same feeling in terms of, the different groups, the different silos, the corporate politics on how to get things done. I think that was the number that I saw that created that shift where, I can no longer just go by someone's desk and have a conversation. Now I had to go to their manager. I had to get prioritized, and it was like, cut my wrist now.
I think, Ramin, you're just saying that you're much better at your job than I was at mine.
I would never say that. I mean, I think, there's different type of situations we solve. Right? At that same company, I also was part of solving, 35 acquisitions. So how do you now integrate 35 entities into this, corporate company? And we kind of went down the shared service model, right? And that's where, product security was one where we left closer to the business versus like pull that into your shared service, right? Because that was where you had to know the product better. And you couldn't just say, well, you're going to do DAST and SAST, and we're going to do pen tests, and that's your product security, right? That's not product security. Those are, tools and capabilities. But how you integrate into each of those teams is where, it's more unique. I am curious, though, as you've now had, the Netflix experience, you now have had the startup experience. I don't know what your future looks like, but, assuming you're going to show up for another head of product type of role in the future, how would you balance, what you've learned between these two different types of programs, right? Because startups are also a whole different experience if you've never worked at a startup.
No, that's a great question. I think having gone through the transition at Netflix, professionally it was a very tumultuous and difficult transition for me to go through. There are people at Netflix that may recall some of my difficulties, and I'm ever grateful for the people that helped me through that. Like my boss, I'll say a shout out to Anthony Park for helping me through that. But there are a bunch of people at Netflix. Even in the C-suite, there are people that helped me to make through that transition. And I think I know enough now to be. I'm capable of doing that now. I didn't get the memo that the 1,500 employee mark meant that our culture had changed. I didn't know that was coming, and I kept doing the same old thing that I had been doing my entire time at Netflix, and it got me into trouble. And so what I would do differently now is I would that transition from it's organically all going to be magic and it's going to work because we all know each other, trust each other, and know that we all have just the desire to make the best possible product that we can. To hey, back to my earlier point. This team's in our way. They're preventing us from doing something we want to do, right? And so the transition to, hey, we're consultants now. We're never here to be the police. We don't ever want to be, the authoritarian dictators that say you can't do something. But I think that a little bit of that discomfort crept in. And my old methods of saying, hey, we can convince these people by just talking to them and making sure that they're aware that we're here to, that didn't work at a certain point, and now I know when that point is going to come, and I'll be much better prepared for that transition.
Interesting. One of the things that I took away, that I have now show up with me as a consultant that's, feels different than those days is, who owns the risk, right? It's similar kind of to what you alluded to, right? I'm not the risk owner when I show up if I'm going to be in a security title, right? My job is to help provide a service, a capability, let you own your risk, let you understand your options, and then I give you guidance and I give you recommendations, right? I think that's one thing where, when I was in my corporate life, I don't know what I call that. I call that more of like, that's communication, right? That's leadership in terms of how you interact with your peers and how you're trying to have, more of a direct conversation versus, conversation about vulnerabilities or, a score on how they did on their last scan, things like that. I find that to be, a lot more of a effective conversation, especially once you start putting dollars to those options, right? Imagine, you have a product, here's the current status, here's the current risk. And to your point, you did a really good job highlighting, risk isn't always black and white, right? Reputational risk, black swan event happening, the fallout of that, the lack of or the loss of trust from your customers. Those are harder to measure, and owners don't always think about that. And then having the options laid out along with costs and then recommendations and then what it does to the risk, right, in terms of reduction or mitigation. I think those are really where I found a lot more success into getting things done because I'm connecting with what someone cares about versus then just hearing, oh, security this, security that, right? And I do work a lot with private equity, and those are hard conversations because a lot of times those are direct conversations to spending money.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. I mean, I was lucky enough to work with Jason Chan when he was at Netflix. And Jason, hi, if you're out there listening. One thing that Jason did really, really well was that we did this quarterly sort of threat analysis. And we built the threat matrix that, had two axes, right? The one axis was what is the potential threat in dollars, right? And the other axis is, what's the probability of this threat actually occurring, right? I mean, and when you multiply those two, actually, I think we added, I can't remember if we multiplied or added, but I replicated that sort of model of a quarterly threat matrix analysis at Humane. And it really put a very fine point on, well, where do we need to be putting our focus? And giving this document on a quarterly basis, and not just giving it, but debating it within the security organizations and product organizations, and then bringing it into a C-suite level discussion was exactly the right way to go. And I want to thank him for teaching me that.
Well, I have one question here as we kind of get to the end of our session, James. And it's kind of a question we've been asking a lot in almost every episode. And it's a question that the industry asks. But I think this will be an interesting perspective, especially, the more recent experience you had at Humane. There was a lot of functionality around utilization of AI. And when we talk AI, we're talking more, kind of generative AI, right? The way it's being used now. I mean, machine learning has been being used for years. But how do you see, when it comes to like a B2C company, because that's really the majority of where your product security experience is, like the end user, right? The everyday person that's going to use a product. Are you finding that there are some real specific use cases that are applicable and actually functional to use generative AI and that kind of technology to enhance product security? I'm just curious if you have any perspective on that.
That's a great question. I do think that the sort of, variance detection type of mechanisms that are fairly popular of, like monitoring network traffic and seeing something weird is happening, I think it's a really good use of the technology. I don't personally have a ton of experience with that. I know some people who do. And so I like this sort of like variance detection, I think is pretty compelling in the security space. I'll give you a more frank and open answer to that. And this plays into how I view product security in general, Jesse, is that I like to shift left so far that a lot of that stuff becomes unnecessary. I know that that sounds very theoretical. If I've got free reign to work with the product designers to do something, like my favorite example right now is privacy, right? So data privacy is something that every company is struggling with. And you could go and you could throw AI on your back end, look at your database retrieval and see what data is being pulled out of there. And we all should do that, right? We all should have tools looking for, variance detection on usage of our database. But the false positives and false negatives there are sometimes harder to manage than just doing it quote unquote right in the first place. And I say one thing that we did at Humane, and I'll say this, that half jokingly, I always said, I want a data breach at Humane to embarrass other companies. And what I mean by that is that what we built at Humane from a data privacy standpoint was so powerful that, again, half jokingly, of course we would have been harmed by a data breach, but we would have been harmed fantastically less than the average, because we did some really specialized things in Humane that may sound geeky, but I'll try to put a fine point on it, or a user experience spin on this. The idea was that when you go to Humane, say your photo album, and if you've got the super paranoid security settings set for your account, you probably wouldn't even see photos pop up. But what you would experience is the device on your chest, the Humane device on your chest would say, "Hey, Jesse, we noticed that you're browsing your album on the web browser. Do you want to enable photo viewing?" And it would
simple.
Yeah, and you'd say yes. It was a voice response to that device, and at that moment, we didn't have the keys to decrypt those photographs. We had no access to that keying material, and so we actually treated the device you wore on your chest as a mobile HSM device, and that would sort of decrypt the wrapped keys, send them back down, and all of a sudden you'd see your photos pop up, and even further than that, you may be paranoid in the sense that there's a lot of talk around location tracking. I know all the automotive industry is in a lot of trouble right now in the state of California for being non-compliant with privacy laws around location tracking, right? And so we get that location. We understood at Humane how important location is, thanks to a lot of people from Apple that had lived through a lot of fire drills with the iPhones and so forth, right? And so location, even as it applied to a tagged photograph, was a separate piece of data. And again, you have those photographs pop up, and if you click on it and say, hey, if you go search for, hey, what, I want to look for what I did in the Santa Cruz Beach last week. Well, we don't have access to the location data at that moment. But again, you could be prompted by the device on your chest in that moment to say, yeah, I do want to search that. And then I don't want to get into what that does for subpoenas and so forth. Jesse, we talked about this previously. It doesn't matter. The subpoena stuff doesn't matter. What matters is that we hold the privacy decisions of the user as sacrosanct, number one. Because I think we did a really great job in developing a user experience that was going to work organically, where the user, if you go on your iPhone right now and you try to manage your privacy settings and your per app, there's this huge matrix of details that you can tweak, right? We didn't have that. We had user experience driven privacy decisions, where in that moment, if you really did want to search for photographs that had a dog in them, you wanted to run that through our back end photograph AI, you could make that decision on the fly as you saw fit.
Wow. That is nice. I was just dealing with that. My son got a phone yesterday for his 11th birthday, which I was hesitant about. And then I was going through the privacy settings in Apple, and I totally understand. It's like this matrix of, if I do this and this, then this doesn't show up. So now I got to go back and fix this. And it was not the best user experience, I have to agree. So having something like that simple would definitely make it easier, right? To ensure there's privacy, but as a user in the moment, even wanting to determine how you do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll be honest here. The security team, we built all of the necessary infrastructure to do all that because of our timeline and how the company kind of ended.
Yeah.
We didn't get to the end game there, but we built everything and had everything working from the standpoint of user being in full control of their privacy. And I'm really proud of my team and the work that they did there. I think that it was a phenomenal effort for them to achieve. So I feel like that's a feather in their cap, and was glad to be the part of it.
That's great.
It feels like, James, just as you're wrapping up, the way you're describing product security, especially moving forward, it's more, integrating with privacy, right? And it requires that use case mindset to think through each of these use cases on, one, how to secure, the different use cases, or, limit the sharing of data, or, leakage of information. And two, even the workflow experience on how does a user, go about doing, these type of new functionality. They don't exist, right? You're creating something new, and you're creating a new experience while integrating, your product into, something that they're doing. It takes a different mindset, right? And the security departments that are showing up with, their vulnerability scanners and, DASTAT, they're missing that, right? They're never gonna, integrated into the use case. They're always just going to be trying to bulk on some kind of toll gate at the end to make sure no criticals or highs go out the door, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I understand, and I can certainly empathize with that world. I mean, it's hard to build a product security organization. I mean, there aren't that many companies that really understand what that even means, and hiring the talent is incredibly difficult for people who have an engineer and user experience mindset. Ramin, you're right. It's this ongoing challenge, but if you do it right, it can go really well. And the organization, I think that the key point at Netflix was not just that we kept a secure product, but they could see that the engineers working in security were really adding to the user experience, right? That was front facing constantly. Now there were definitely stumbles at Netflix. We could recount some of the certificate revocation stuff that the industry has completely failed at, that we tried to leverage, right? And our move to a custom security protocol. And everybody tells you, don't ever build your own security protocol. That's lunacy, right? But the organizations that really understand it, and my guidance to my team was largely make sure that when the user hits play on their remote control, that playback will start within a second. Right.
Wow.
The security was there, and the security was, in some ways, was along for the ride. I'm maybe exaggerating a bit here. It had to be secure, but we were seeing, like, if we tried to leverage TLS, sometimes we would see a 7-second setup time of that tunnel before a single bit of application level data would go across it. And when you hit play on your remote and it takes 7 seconds. Remember the circling thing, right? The buffering thing that we used to always have to deal with on the internet. That was something that we couldn't have for our user anymore. We also often we'd have 24 hours of downtime when a CDN would change their CA provider, right? To rely on these existing technologies. I mean, TLS is wonderful for what it does, but it doesn't do user experience. TLS isn't interested in user experience. We were very much, focused on that. So we ended up actually creating a couple of protocols. Version 1 I wrote as an engineer. Version 2 I designed as a director and didn't implement. And it did a lot of things really wonderfully. Unfortunately, it was kind of overly complicated because the engineer who wrote it, but it was his first time out working on that type of thing. But writing your own protocols is something that you kind of have to do sometimes, because that's the only way to get to that user experience that you really need. In our case, it was user experience, but it was also uptime. We couldn't rely on TLS to maintain an uptime when there were these revocation problems and CA issuance problems.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we've come to the end of our time. This was great. I think we could continue talking about this for another hour. So we'll have to have you on again, James. This was really an interesting conversation. And I think maybe the next time, it'd be interesting to kind of hear deeper thoughts around privacy and how to really think about that in a product level program, especially when it comes to, everything really. We appreciate you joining. Look forward to maybe another conversation in the future on our show. And yeah, thank you for all that you shared. Hopefully this is really helpful for those that are trying to figure out, how do I think about building a world-class product security program, and especially if they get to do it from the ground up. So thank you, James, so much for joining us and being part of the show.
Thank you,
James.
Jesse and Ramin. I really enjoyed it. I can go on for hours about this, and you gave me you gave me an avenue for that. So thank you. And, happy to come on
Absolutely.
again sometime. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thanks,
Take
man.
care. Thanks so much.